Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, and I can hear you. Okay, I'll just wait for a minute to see if anyone else comes. Oops. Okay, I'm just getting things set up. How is my internet? Should I use? Oops. Should I use my phone's internet, or is the connection okay?
You're kind of frozen, but the voice is kind of good. But your video is
Yeah,
bad.
I'm just uploading something. I'm just emailing myself the Niçe reading. My the went a little bit ago. I'll go via the phone. Let me see if I can do that. No, I was just saying that. Yeah, I'm going to use my hotspot. Oh, yeah. We were. Hello? Can you hear me now? It took a bit of time. I went to my phone's internet. For some reason, every Tuesday we have a power cut, and really annoying. Today it happened just before class, so I had to restart my computer and everything. At some point, we may have another power cut because it's Kutulush, and we have at least once a week. So if I disappear, I'll just come in via my phone. Okay, so today I wanted to carry on talking about Niçe, and we're talking about the genealogy. And on Tuesday, in Wednesday in class, I gave you a little overview of the whole genealogy. And I talked a bit about, there's 3 essays. The first essay is on the sort of what he calls the slave revolt in morality. It's got to do with these 2 different ways of, 2 different systems, he takes it, of values. You've got the sort of values of the Homeric heroes, which is a sort of aristocratic form of valuation. And so these aristocratic heroes, their basic idea was good, noble, fine, very egoistical, me. And bad was just like unlucky, poor, weak. Yeah. And the attitude the good had towards the bad was one of pity. Yeah. If someone is weak, is a slave, is tortured, you may enjoy it, but you also if you have any sort of feeling towards them, it's probably going to be something like pity or contempt, maybe a bit of disgust. Yeah. Whereas he thinks that in the modern world, we have this new form of valuation where we contrast good to evil. And in this form of valuation, the evil is the positive. Yeah. Domination, powerful, unfair, egoistical. And the good is defined negatively in terms of not being like that. Yeah. So he thinks that and he thinks that it has its origin in what he calls ressentiment, the sort of self-hatred, the sort of those who are sort of weak and downtrodden. Yeah, so that's the first essay. The second essay, we have a discussion of conscience, bad conscience, guilt, and punishment. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that today. In the third essay, we have the idea that, so in the second essay, we have this idea that the notion of punishment, so he introduces the idea of conscience, in the first few sections. And conscience, I think, is a good thing always for Niçe. It's what distinguishes us from animals. It's what makes us sovereign individuals. What makes us kind of temporal beings. Yeah, so we have this notion of being able to have commitments, having a past, having a future. That's all good. But then we have this sort of Christianized bad conscience. So bad conscience is you might think of as this idea of guilt. The idea of guilt, is normally tied towards notions of responsibility. And Niçe is quite critical of notions of guilt and responsibility. And he tells a story that the feeling of guilt originated as we have as animals living in the world in the social world. We're not allowed to act on our feelings. We have a lot of frustration and pain. And once we've got some notion of punishment, that Niçe thinks that pain itself isn't bad, suffering itself isn't that bad. What's bad is meaningless. What's bad for us is meaningless suffering. So if we have some pain that we can kind of give some meaning to, the pain itself isn't that bad. Does anyone go to the gym? You go to the gym, you run, you go through your barrier, and you have this real rush. There you've got physical pain, but it's meaningful pain. So the pain isn't that bad. What you're doing is you're building your muscles. And if you didn't feel the pain, you wouldn't feel like you'd done your workout. Yeah. So suffering, when it's interpreted, can be valuable. And so Niçe thinks that the feeling of guilt is a way of interpreting suffering. We interpret our suffering as punishment. And by interpreting our suffering as punishment, this gives meaning to our suffering. Yeah, it gives value to our suffering, and therefore we don't it's not so bad. Yeah, as yeah, yeah, yeah. And Nietzsche thinks, though, that this way of interpreting pain and suffering is just unhealthy. Yeah, the ancient Greeks sort of interpreted pain and suffering as sort of entertainment for the gods rather than punishment. So Nietzsche, one of the things in section 3, in essay 2, has got to do with the way in which he thinks the Christian modern way of interpreting suffering as punishment is unhealthy. Yeah, and so let's try and find other ways of self-interpreting ourselves. Yeah, this is the big thing in book 2. Now, of course, punishment then plays a central role. And so what does Nietzsche have to say about punishment? And after I've talked a little bit about book 3, that's how I'm going to start today's class, by talking about Nietzsche's story about punishment in book 2. And this is tied to Nietzsche's understanding of the value, function, and purpose of a genealogy. So we've got this idea of the genealogy of morals. And then one question we might want to ask ourselves is, well, what's the value or purpose of a genealogy of morals? And what does Nietzsche think of genealogy? And it turns out that he thinks that we shouldn't confuse the origin of something with its meaning. These are two separate things. Yeah, so we'll come back to this. So that's chapter 2, essay 2. The third essay is on aesthetic ideals. And aesthetic ideals are these ideals of self-denial. Yeah, saying no in a certain sense, denying our needs, etc. Now, the most obvious form of aestheticism is going to be people who go out there and don't eat. But one of the things Nietzsche thinks is that he thinks that science itself, yeah, insofar as it's based on the will to truth, is a form of asceticism. So insofar as you sort of engage in and value science and truth, this valuation of truth, understood as something transcendent. If we think of truth as something ideal, something transcendent, then valuing truth, yeah, involves valuing something that is sort of ideal and non-real. Yeah, so we sort of say yes to the ideal, and saying yes to the ideal is a form of saying no to the real. And so Nietzsche, I think one of the main themes in essay number 3 has got to do with questioning the value of truth. Yeah, he talks about that, and he thinks that, so one of the things that's interesting about Nietzsche is that he thinks that if you care about truth, this is something that truth itself makes you do, the desire for truth. So the will to truth is sort of self-undermining, it's self-critical. Yeah, and so I take this kind of questioning the value of truth, the will to truth, questioning the will to truth. I take this as very much a sort of part of the Enlightenment project, yeah, where you've got reason questioning itself. So Kant has this idea of the critique of pure reason critiquing itself. And I think Nietzsche's questioning of the will to truth can be put in the same context, I think. So I take it that my reading of Nietzsche is Nietzsche doesn't end up totally rejecting truth. Yeah, there is a role for truth and the value of truth. It's just that if we care about truth, then we have to question the value of truth. And Nietzsche thinks that the will to truth is only one road to take. Yeah. So if we think about, well, what's the alternative to the will to truth? And Nietzsche, any thoughts? What's going to be the alternative to the will to truth? We have this will to truth which drives philosophy and science. Any thoughts? So Nietzsche talks about the will to deception. yeah, which he ties together with art and creativity and the poet. Yeah. And so he finishes off the genealogy by opposing these sort of two sorts of wills, the will to truth and the will to deception, philosophy and poetry, Homer and Plato. So at the end of the, Plato banned poets from his ideal republic. And so at the end, he finishes up with this idea of Plato versus Homer. Now, you might think that what Nietzsche is advocating is a form of irrationalist aesthetics. Yeah, that in some sense art redeems everything, and we should stop doing philosophy and instead just do poetry. And I think this is how some, last time I said postmodernists, but I mean Frenchies. Yeah, some of these sort of French post-war interpreters of Nietzsche, I think, took this sort of attitude, where they thought that Nietzsche is sort of rejecting philosophy and is rejecting philosophy and truth. My sort of reading of Nietzsche is that no, this isn't right. So Nietzsche is committed to a form of perspectivism or perspectivalism. And I take it that Nietzsche's idea is that one should embrace both art and science, both philosophy and poetry. Yeah. And so, and in some sense, these two values are not compatible. Yeah. So Nietzsche's idea is that there's nothing wrong with embracing seemingly incompatible values. Yeah. The only reason that you might have a problem with this is if you believe in the idea of a single all-embracing perspective that should contain all the other perspectives. And this is something Nietzsche is going to reject. So I take it Nietzsche's kind of idea is not a rejection of truth. Questioning the value of truth is not, the will to truth is not, it's, the will to truth is something that drives Nietzsche. But I take it the idea is that we don't need to choose between philosophy and poetry. We can choose both. Yeah. That someone writing around the same time as Nietzsche at the end of the 19th century is Walt Whitman, who very famously in one of his poems says, I contain multitudes. And I think this is the sort of my understanding of the Nietzschean sort of ideal, that the Nietzschean ideal of character is to contain multitudes. Yeah, and the sort of danger is to take a single perspective, to think that we can have this sort of single perspective that embraces everything. Yeah, so being able to sort of embrace opposites is, I take it, Nietzsche's the sort of an ideal that Nietzsche goes for. And so I last week we were talking about John Stuart Mill, and I suggested that Mill, sets up this dichotomy between, contrast between Protestantism that denies life and paganism. And Mill has these sort of pagan sympathies for pagan affirmation. And I think that Nietzsche was a classical philologist. He was immersed in the classical world. And I think his sort of sensibilities are pagan. They're against a form of monotheism. Yeah, in the Christian world, you have a single God. Yeah, you have a single ultimate final perspective. That Nietzsche is a sort of pluralist about value, a pluralist about perspectives, from both the theoretical and from the practical perspective, which is like, insofar as there's any sort of God, you anything divine, you have gods, not God. And this sort of attraction to this sort of paganism, I think it's something that Nietzsche, in his early life, one of the big influences on Nietzsche was Hölderlin, the poet, the Romantic poet, who also had this idea of remythologizing the world, of, in some sense, introducing new gods. And I think that this sort of pagan idea, that anti-monotheistic idea, is quite central to Nietzsche. If we get rid of monotheism, what's left? if we get rid of the idea of a single God, how do we live? And I think one of the things is that Nietzsche very famously, and thus says, is it Zarathustra, says God is dead and we have killed him. Now this is the guy coming down from the mountain. And the death of God is something that is in the background here. So Nietzsche thinks that in the 19th century, many people have come to not believe in God. Yep. But in some sense, they're atheists on paper, but they're still thinking theologically. And in particular, I think one of the sort of theological things they're kind of committed to is a sort of monotheism, a sort of monistic view of things. But once you get rid of God, once you get rid of a God's eye perspective on the world, what's going to be left of a God's eye? Once you've got rid of, if you don't think God exists, then in some sense, there's no room in your world for a God's eye perspective. Yeah. And this is going to push you towards a form of quite radical pluralism, I take it. Yeah, so I know a lot of sort of analytic metaphysicians. Have any of you ever met any analytic metaphysicians? Yeah. And most of the analytic metaphysicians I know are sort of atheists. Oh, we're materialists, we don't believe in God. But their whole metaphysics, at some point, they'll talk about they'll just introduce the idea of a God's eye perspective of the universe. Yeah. Kind of how would things be like from this godly? But I mean, I think Nietzsche sort of thought is, if you kind of stop believing in God, you've also got to get rid of the idea of a God's eye perspective. And if you get rid of this idea of a God's eye perspective, this is going to open you up towards a kind of form of radical pluralism, where the idea of the world as a whole, the world as a totality, no longer makes sense. Now, this is something quite Kantian as well. So Nietzsche's very opposed to Kant. But one of the things Kant wants to attack is the idea of a unified final finished science. He thinks this is an ideal of pure reason. It's a sort of regulative ideal. We seek unity, but it's a sort of form of human arrogance to think that just because human rationality seeks for unity and seeks for completeness, that the world itself is going to be complete or total. Yeah, so we care about totality. This is what reason demands, some sort of totality. But why should we assume that the world, in some sense, is rational? Why should we assume that the world in itself is such that it conforms with the demands of human reason? And so I take it that the sort of Nietzschean Kantian, I take this to be the sort of Nietzschean Kantian thought, is that those who believe in this unified single perspective are basically committed to a very strong theological position. Yeah, and this is something he wants to reject. So that's my outline of the 3 essays of the genealogy. And rather than reading through in order, I mean, you're supposed to do that. I'm going to jump about a bit. So there's a bunch of stuff I quite like in the genealogy, and I want to kind of make sure we cover all of that. And so I'm going to jump about a bit. In today's class, I'm not sure how far I'm going to get, but what I want to start with is the middle of the second essay. So this is essay 2, number 12. Oops. So this is on page, starting on page 76. So up until this point, Nietzsche's been talking about the origin of punishment. How did punishment come about? And Nietzsche's idea, and this discussion of the origin of punishment is a kind of sub-argument in his account of the origin of guilt, of what he calls bad conscience, because guilt for Nietzsche is pain interpreted as punishment. So then the question is, how did punishment come about? Now, one thing is that today we might think that the notion of punishment presupposes guilt. So punishment is a form of sanction that we apply to someone who's guilty. We apply to someone who's responsible. And Nietzsche thinks that because he thinks that guilt is pain interpreted as punishment, that somehow we've got to offer an account of the origin of the practice of punishment that doesn't presuppose societies that have any understanding or concept of guilt. Yeah, so he thinks the origin of punishment had nothing to do with guilt and responsibility. Yeah, so punishment was a practice that arose unconnected to notions of punishment, of guilt and responsibility. I think this is true. Like, you know, in ancient Greek stories, people get punished because of what their parents did. You punish a whole city for its rulers. Yeah, you punish, you know, like if someone's done you something wrong, you kill their whole family. Yep. So notions of this sort of punishment weren't really tied, Nietzsche thinks, to notions of responsibility and guilt. So the story Nietzsche tells is that in primitive societies, early human societies, you had economic relations of exchange. In these economic relations of exchange, you had debtors and creditors. And to be in debt, the word for guilt in German, schuldig, is related etymologically to the word for debt, Schuld. Yeah, so being in debt and being in guilt is sort of connected. So Nietzsche's idea is that the practice of punishment emerged because people, you had this debtor-creditor relationship, and sometimes you couldn't pay back someone what you owed them. I give you something, you're going to give me something, and you don't do it. And so instead of being paid back what you promised me, I've got to be paid back in some other way. And Nietzsche's idea is that the sort of repayment was in terms of being allowed to hurt you. Yeah. And then he asks, well, how could that be any repayment? If you owe me 100 lira and you don't give it to me, and instead I just get to hit you a bit, how does that in any way repay me $100? And Nietzsche's idea is well, there's some pleasure, enjoyment in inflicting cruelty. Yeah, there's this joy of the festival. He gives lots of examples about how, you know, punishment was a sort of spectator sport. There's a sort of pleasure in inflicting pain on others. And Nietzsche thinks that this pleasure is greater the weaker you are. So the weaker you are, the more sort of pleasure you're going to get from being allowed to inflict harm on others. Yep. The stronger you get, the stronger a society is, the stronger an individual is, the less need it's going to have to punish. Yep. Actually, I was going to start by talking about number 12, but I guess there was something else I was going to talk about, and I guess I might as well talk about it now. So one of Nietzsche's sort of personal commitments, I think, in a certain way, or personal political ethical commitments, was to be someone who was sort of against punishment and retributivism. So he thinks that in a kind of in our world, punishment's really important. I think he thinks that in a kind of new system of values, the sort of world he wants to live in, that punishment and retribution would be sort of rejected. Yeah, that he sort of so this is in number 10. So I'm just going to find the screen. Okay, I'm going to share now. So this is just before where I was going to talk. so in section number 10, yeah, he says, as its power increases, the community ceases to take the individual's transgressions so seriously, because they can no longer be considered as dangerous and destructive to the whole as they were formerly. Yeah. So the stronger the society, the stronger the individual, the weaker the will, the demand to punish. So he says, as the power and self-confidence of the community increases, the penal law always becomes more moderate. Yeah, that. And then he says, it is not unthinkable that a society might attain such a consciousness of power that it could allow itself the noblest luxury possible to it, letting those who harm it go unpunished. What are my parasites to me, it might say. May they live and prosper. I am strong enough for that. So in terms of Nietzsche's positive ethics, I think he's got this idea of a world where we go beyond retributivism, where we go beyond the will to punish. And I take it here, he's sort of hedging himself. He doesn't advocate this, but this idea of the self-overcoming of justice he talks about. One knows the beautiful name it has given itself, mercy. And it goes without saying that mercy remains the privilege of the most powerful man. Yeah, or better, his beyond the law. And so elsewhere, so in Dawn, of course, Dawn, daybreak, is an enlightenment motif. Yeah, and so I think that he's interested in enlightenment, but he wants to take enlightenment and the critique of reason to a step further. Yeah, where we don't just critique pure reason, but reason in some sense has to question the value of truth and rationality. And he says, and in Dawn, he says, let us eliminate the concept of sin from the world, and let us soon dispatch the concept of punishment after it. Yeah, may these exiled monsters, sin and punishment, live somewhere else henceforth and not amongst men, if they insist on living and will not perish of disgust with themselves. Shouldn't we be mature enough yet for the opposite view? Shouldn't we be able to say yet, every guilty person is sick? Not the hour, no, the hour for that has not yet come. As yet, the physicians are lacking above all. As yet, no thinker has had the courage of measuring the health of a society and of individuals according to how many parasites they can stand. So Nietzsche is sort of, yeah, he in terms of his positive ethics that goes beyond the Christian ethics, I think he's very much against retributivism. He's very much against punishment, the idea of sin. That society should regard those who break the law not as kind of responsible individuals, criminals who need punishment, but just basically as sick people who maybe need treatment, who need to be restrained. Yeah. When I was growing up, this sort of attitude towards punishment, I think, used to be the standard understanding of punishment and criminality amongst the progressives and people on the left. So I think there was a tendency for things like prison reform and let's go beyond retributivism and the idea of punishment. I think the sort of new 21st century left tends to be very much into punishment. Yeah, there's a sort of vindictiveness to some sort of things. That I was just reading yesterday. I was reading stuff about Louis C.K., who, you know, exposed himself to some women, got rightly, I think, sort of punished. But that's the idea that someone's done something wrong, and for the rest of their life, that, you know, that one should always have to live this responsibility. I think this is something that Nietzsche is very strongly and profoundly against, the idea that finding people responsible and the sort of vindictive attitude towards punishment, which I take it in the 60s. So this, I think Nietzsche in many ways is someone who's on the right. I think his attitudes towards punishment, I think, are things that sort of tie him to the sort of progressives from the sort of 60s to the 90s, which I think has sort of now changed. I think this idea that we should have mercy and we should just regard criminals as sick, or people who violate norms as sick rather than vicious. I think there's been this move away from it. So this is his view about punishment. Now, what I wanted to start talking about today was number 12. So everything else I said so far is a sort of little digression before I got to what I wanted to focus on today. And yeah, so this book is a genealogy of morals. So the book is offering an account, Nietzsche's sort of account is supposed to be a historical account of the emergence of modern morality. Yeah, and one thing you might ask, and well, you know, one of his claims, big claims, is that, well, you've got Christianity, you've got the Christian morality, which is a morality of love. And one of the claims is that the emergence of this morality arose out of a kind of vengefulness, out of resentment, out of hatred, out of a kind of love of cruelty. And Nietzsche thinks there's something paradoxical and funny about this story, that something that claims to be a morality of love has its roots in vindictiveness and hatred. Yeah, but having said that, I think Nietzsche himself thinks that the questions we ask about the value and meaning of something today, it turns out that its origins are not essential. We can separate the origin of something from its current value. Yeah, so something may have had a sort of disgusting origin, but be beautiful. Yeah, yeah, and so the fact that we need to separate the origin of something from its meaning. Yeah, and this is going to be something that's central to Nietzsche. And so I think one thing is when you first read the genealogy, and if you don't read it carefully, it looks like, in some sense, Nietzsche is using this genealogical count in a sort of undermining way. He's using these historical stories that, if they're true, that might, in some sense, undermine our commitments to things. But Nietzsche himself, I think, doesn't think that's right. So, because we've got to separate the question of the meaning of things from their origins. So Nietzsche tells this story. He says, "Yet a word on the origin and the purpose of punishment." Yep. These are two problems that are separate, or ought to be separate. So we've got the origin of punishment and the purpose of punishment. With purpose, he's going to tie this to meaning. Yeah, so we've got, on the one hand, we've got a story about the origin of something. On the other hand, we've got our story about its function, its purpose, its meaning. And these two things, he thinks, come apart. So when it comes to punishment, we've got the practice of punishing. Yeah, so we've got this social practice that emerges. And this social practice may emerge without anyone really thinking about it. So practices can come into existence before they acquire any sort of meaning. But once we have a practice, once we have a social practice that's come into existence, then we can sort of, then as a community, we reflect on it and we give it a meaning, we interpret it. So as interpreting animals, we don't just interpret ourselves, but our social practices are interpreted. Yep. And so when we've got a practice, we need to distinguish the practice from its interpretation. And it's going to turn out that in any complex society, for any practice that has a long history, there are going to be multiple overlapping interpretations. Yeah, so there is going to be a certain type of practice that's coming to existence. And what's its purpose? What's its meaning? It doesn't have a purpose. It doesn't have a meaning. There's a whole bunch of overlapping purposes or meaning. Thus, he says, unfortunately, these are normally confounded. Yeah. Now these previous genealogists, I think these are the people he's calling the English historians of morality. Some of them, I think, were Scottish. He says they seek out some purpose in punishment, for example, revenge or deterrence, and then guilelessly place this purpose at the beginning as the cause of origin of punishment. Yeah, so you look at some practice and you look at the function of the practice today, and then you kind of, in some sense, you take the function or the goal, the present goal of something as its cause. And Niçe wants to reject this, that things sort of emerge for various reasons. And the causes they end up acquiring aren't, and I think Niçe thinks can't be the causes of the emergence of the thing. Yep. Now, the sort of current purpose of a practice may be what stabilizes the practice. So you've got a practice that's come into existence, and then it's interpreted or it acquires a certain function. And once it's acquired that function, you might think that having this function is then what allows the practice to persist. Yeah, but the cause of the persistence of a practice is going to be different from the cause of the origin of the practice. Yep, and I think this Nietzschean account of the distinction between origin and function is a general principle that doesn't just apply to social practices, but is what I think that he wants to apply to evolutionary biology. Yeah, so we've got a certain organ that has a certain function within the body, but that we can't say the current function of the organ is the cause of the coming into being of the organ. The cause of the coming into being of the organ, you know, nature doesn't know anything about these future purposes. Yeah, you've got to tell some mechanistic story about how this thing came into existence through, I don't know, random mutation, whatever story you want to tell. Yeah. So so this is an important methodology. So today, to begin with, I wanted to focus on these methodological aspects of Nietzsche's position. Yeah, Nietzsche's methodology, understanding of how philosophy works. So he says the cause of the origin of a thing and its eventual utility, its actual employment and place in a system of purposes, lies worlds apart. Whatever exists, having somehow come into being, is again and again reinterpreted to new ends, taken over, transformed, and redirected by some power superior to it. All events in the organic world are a subduing, a becoming master. Yeah. So here he's talking about organs, not social practices, but the story he wants to tell about the emergence of social institutions, he thinks is analogous to the story we want to tell about the emergence of biological entities, for example, organs. So we might think of social institutions and practices as organs in the body, in the social fabric, the social body. So we have a similar story. However well one has understood the utility of any physiological organ or legal institution, a social custom, a political usage, a form in art or in religious cult, this means nothing regarding its origin. Yeah. So the questions of the function or purpose of something and questions about its origin, Nietzsche thinks have to be separated. Yeah, so he's, in some sense, this is quite, you know, this is very scientific. Yeah, that we don't appeal to final causes when we're offering a mechanistic account of the origin of some particular thing, whether it be an organ, a social practice, etc. This sort of view about the origin of social practices, I think someone else who has a very similar sort of view, who's a sort of ally of Nietzsche here, is going to be Hume. So Hume in the third book of the treatise, when he's talking about the emergence of justice, says that justice has to come into existence before the practices of justice have to come into existence before we can reflect on their value. And so the Hume thinks that the practices of justice are sort of conventions that sort of emerge. And the emergence of these conventions, we can't presuppose that people first of all have the idea of a social contract and then bring it into existence. Yeah, and so Nietzsche, the Hume's story is that some conventions can emerge, like rowing a boat. When two people are rowing a boat, you've got to row in time. But you can't first of all think about how to do it and then do it. You both start rowing until you find yourself rowing in time. And then you're like, oh, that's good, we're moving forward. Let's carry on doing what we're doing. So the kind of convention, the practice emerges prior to our understanding of it, our reflection of it, our valuation of it. Yeah. So now, if this is right, then it means that we can't say that punishment was devised for punishing. So why did, you know, when someone punishes someone, so suppose Ali Jan's a bit older and he's a bit naughty, and I tell him he's got to go to bed without supper, yeah, because I want to do where the wild things are. You might think, well, I'm punishing him because he deserves to be punished, and so we might think, well, punishment was devised in order to punish people who violated certain rules. But yeah, Nietzsche thinks that can't be right. Yeah, because that presupposes that we first of all have the idea of punishment and then bring it into existence. Whereas Nietzsche's got this quite Humean idea that kind of things, practices, norms sort of emerge as conventions. And then it's only after they've come into existence that we can reflect on them, interpret them, and understand their value or function. Okay, that's an important methodological point. Let's have a break now, and then I want to talk about number 13. Yeah, I'll start after the break. I'm going to talk about number 13, which is also methodological. And then once I've talked about section 213, then I want to talk about Nietzsche's perspectivism and perspectivalism, which is in book 3, let's say essay 3, section 12. And then once I've done that, I might say a little bit about science and art, and then we'll move back to the beginning and we'll work through section 1 if we have time. Otherwise, we'll do that next class. Okay. So let's have a 10-minute break. Let's have a 10-minute break. Okay, I'm back. Anyone else? Is there anyone out there? My internet working? Oh, yep. You can hear me? Okay. So any questions about what I was talking about earlier? Any thoughts? Okay. So let's jump into number 13. So remember that, let's return to our publish. This is the next section, subject punishment. So one must distinguish two aspects. On the one hand, that in which it is relatively enduring, the custom, the act, the drama, a certain strict sequence of procedures. Yeah, so this is what I'm talking about as sort of punishment as a social practice. You've got this social practice, which is a custom, a drama, a strict sequence of procedures. On the other hand, that in it which is fluid, the meaning, the purpose, the expectation associated with the performance of such procedures. So you've got it with the example of punishment, you've got a certain practice, then which is sort of relatively fixed, relatively stable, something that doesn't change dramatically over time. Yeah. So of course, the practice itself does change to some degree. So you've got, that it might become more strict. It might become less violent. Yeah, it might focus on the soul rather than the body. This is sort of Foucault's redoing of Niçe in Discipline and Punish, where he talks about the way modern punishment emerged. So there is going to be obviously there's going to be some change in the custom. Yeah, but you've got a social practice that the nature of the practice changes fairly slowly. But then you've got that which is fluid, which changes more quickly, which is the meaning, the purpose, the expectation associated with the performance of such procedures. And the idea is that the procedure itself will be something older, earlier than its employment in punishment. So the latter, the fluid part, the purpose, the meaning, is projected and interpreted into the procedure. Yep. So you've got a practice and its interpretation. And interpretation always presupposes some sort of procedure. There is some practice that needs to be interpreted. But of course, once you've got interpretation, I take it Nietzsche's idea is that the interpretations sort of change the practice, or they change what punishment is. As it becomes reinterpreted, the punishment itself changes. So so the procedure was not invented for the purpose of punishing. The hand was not invented for the purpose of grasping. Yeah. Now, what about this fluid element? So I think one thing about Nietzsche, and I think this is something in Charles Taylor in his interpretation of Hegel makes this sort of central in his understanding of Hegel, that for both Nietzsche and I think Hegel, man is a sort of, or the human being is a sort of interpreting animal. Yeah, so interpretation is going to be central. And I take it with social institutions. Social institutions aren't just procedures. They're procedures that are always interpreted. Yeah, because of our nature as interpreters. Because for us, pain is not so bad. What's really bad for beings like us is meaninglessness. We're beings that search for meaning. Yeah, and the meaning that's out there in some sense is a meaning that we have to supply. And this is why we need poets and not just philosophers, because poets are the sort of inventors of meaning. Yeah, once meanings have been invented, then in some sense they infuse the world. and then they can be further understood and interpreted. So as for the other element in punishment, the fluid element, and this is an interesting, important passage, its meaning in a very late condition of culture. The concept of punishment possesses, in fact, not one meaning, but a whole synthesis of meanings. So for the previous history of punishment in general, the history of its employment for the most various purposes, finally crystallizes into a kind of unity that is hard to disentangle, hard to analyze, and, as must be emphasized, especially totally indefinable. Today, it is impossible to say for certain why people are really punished. All concepts in which an entire process is semiotically concentrated elude definition. And here is one of the kind of famous quotes from Niçe: "Only that which has no history is definable." Anything with a history can't be defined. Now, that's news for analytic philosophy. Yeah, if you think the task of philosophy is to kind of give us definitions, which are sort of sets of necessary and sufficient conditions, the idea is you're not going to get them for things that have a history. And almost all the things we care about are things with a history. That up until the 19th century, biological species were thought of as non-historical. Yeah, so you have the idea that and therefore each species can be defined. Yeah, so a human being is one species amongst others, and you can define what a human being is. First of all, you have to know its genus. Well, it's an animal, and then you have to know its specific difference. What distinguishes it from all other animals? It's human. So up until the 19th century, species were taken to be things that didn't have a history. God created the world, and he created all the different kinds of animals on the first day. With Darwin and the rise of evolution, yeah, we come to see that biological kinds aren't things that have existed eternally, but they're things with histories. And then it turns out, yeah, that we can't really define what it is to be a human being. You know, what it is to be a species is to be a member of a population in which you've got the possibility of reproduction. It's a very messy concept. Yeah, it's you can't define it in terms of DNA. So that's not how definitions work in biology. It's speciation. Yeah, so once you've got things that are historical, Nietzsche thinks, then you don't have a single meaning. Yeah, and so things that have a history can't be defined. Yeah, all you can maybe do is elucidate the things by looking at the various types of meanings they have. Yeah, so you got punishment, which is a sort of set of procedures, and these procedures have a sort of history. But then what is punishment? Well, you've got to add the interpretations. And that once we start doing this, that there's a whole bunch of interlacing, sometimes contradictory interpretations, yeah, that aren't always consistent. And a full understanding of what punishment is going to involve all of this stuff. It's going to involve understanding the phenomena from a whole bunch of different perspectives, understanding this sort of messy history. Yeah, so and you might think, yeah, this is why I was making a bit of a joke about analytic philosophy. I think today, of course, very few philosophers think that the task of philosophy is to arrive at definitions. But in the 1950s, there was a kind of sub-school of analytic philosophy that thought really what you're doing is arriving at definitions, and you do this by, you know, you got some phenomena, and then you're trying to give a set of necessary and sufficient conditions. And then you find a sort of counterexample, which shows that the definition is inadequate. And then you have to sort of refine the definition to take account of the counterexample. That's a kind of think about Gettier cases. If you've done epistemology, you've got knowledge is justified true belief. Oh, look, here's something that seems to be knowledge, but isn't justified true belief. So that definition can't be right. Oh, let's fiddle around with the definition a bit until we kind of get a more adequate definition. And I think that, yeah, I very few people are into this now. I think the most important bit of epistemology in the last 20 years is probably Tim Williamson's kind of knowledge first epistemology, explicit that knowledge, you're sort of realist about knowledge. Knowledge is a certain thing out there. It can't be defined. You know, we can sort of point to it. We can give some sort of criteria maybe, but it's not the sort of thing that can be defined. And so, yeah, so we have this plurality of meanings. Things that have a history that are interpreted, there's a plurality of meanings. And I think that as human beings, as human individuals, we have a history. So what are you, Zeynep? You're a sort of biological process. You might think that that's something that is a bit like the procedures. You're this living animal that has a body, you eat, and you're a whole bunch of systems of metabolism. But you're also this being that is constantly interpreting and reinterpreting yourself. And so you don't just have a history of this quite simple history of biological processes, but you've got a whole crisscrossing set of interpretations and reinterpretations. So I think what Niçe has to say about punishment also, I think, can be said about the self. Because what a human being is, first of all, we're these biological creatures, but we're also these biological creatures that interpret ourselves. And we do it, we have multiple, we don't have a single interpretation. We just have a whole bunch of crisscrossing interpretations. So we can't define ourselves. There's lots of things we can say about ourselves, but we can't define ourselves. A nice paragraph. This sums up a lot of the things we've been talking about. It says, to give at least an idea of how uncertain, how supplemental, how accidental the meaning of punishment is, yeah, and how one and the same procedure can be employed, interpreted, adapted to ends that differ fundamentally. I set down here a pattern that has emerged from consideration of relatively few chance instances I have noted. So this is just a random list of things we can say about punishment. Punishment is a means of rendering harmless, yeah, a means of preventing further harm. Punishment is a recompense to the injured party for the harm done, rendered in any form, even in that of compensating affect. There's a repayment of the victim. Punishment is the isolation of a disturbance of equilibrium, so as to guard against any further spread of the disturbance. You know, think about it. Oh, we've got this disturbance of the equilibrium. We've got to kind of go and eat it. Punishment is a means of inspiring fear of those who determine and execute punishment. Punishment is a kind of repayment for the advantages the criminal has enjoyed hitherto. So it's a sort of repayment for the advantages. For example, when he's employed as a slave in the mines. Punishment is the expulsion of a degenerate element. In some cases of an entire branch, as in Chinese law. That's the means of preserving the purity of a race or maintaining a social type. Punishment is a festival. So this has been one of the big themes he's been looking at, that punishment is a form of entertainment. Yeah, and as a source of pleasure. So, you know, executions used to be big public events and everyone would turn up and buy popcorn. You know, it was the most exciting thing for television. You know, like, what should we do? They hadn't invented football, but they had the public executions. Punishment is a festival, namely as the rape and mockery of a finally defeated enemy. Yeah, punishment as the making of a memory, whether for him who suffers the punishment, so-called improvement, or for those who witness its execution. Punishment is a payment as a fee stipulated by the power that protects the wrongdoer from the excesses of revenge. Punishment is a compromise with revenge in its natural state, when the latter is still maintained and claimed as a privilege by a powerful clan. Punishment is a declaration of war and a war measure against an enemy of peace. Of the law of order of the authorities, whom as a danger to the community, as one who has broken the contract that defines the conditions under which it exists, as a rebel, a traitor, a breaker of the peace, one opposes with the means of war. So, I mean, punishment can be understood in all these ways. I take it the thought is that you might think, well, which one of the sort of many philosophers are then going to ask, well, which one is the correct interpretation? Which one is the true interpretation? And this is where Nietzsche is going to say, well, punishment is all of these things. And at different times, different aspects get highlighted. Maybe in different societies, certain notions of punishment are the dominant one. Yeah. Oh, someone said my voice is broken, but I guess that was from earlier. Yeah. I mean, he's in love. I think he's not in love. He's in love with hearing himself talk about punishment. Yeah. Yeah. But he's in love with the fact that he is a phenomenon that has so many sides. Yeah. He's in love with the intricity and the interestingness of it. Yeah. One thing about the Romantics, who I think Nietzsche was kind of very much influenced by, is that up until the Romantics, the main, well, you know, it used to be that the main aesthetic quality was the beautiful. I think in the kind of 18th century, then you had the idea of the sublime. Some of the Romantics kind of this was one thing, that the overwhelming, for people like the early Romantics, so people like Schlegel, who kind of promoted the idea of the novel, of the roman. So Romantics is tied to the idea of the roman or the novel. And for Schlegel, the most important aesthetic quality is the interesting. Yeah, so the thing about novels isn't that they're beautiful or sublime, but that they're interesting. They're constantly interpretable. So I think that in some sense, punishment is interesting for Nietzsche because it has so many facets. It's you know, you're not going to run out of possibilities of interpretation. Yeah, so it's a sort of, yeah, I think it's the kind of multifacetedness of it that sort of interests him, and he's sort of stressing here. But I think, you know, remember that I said last time that he wants to, you know, his idea of an ethics of a value system of the future is one that rejects retribution. Yeah, that in some sense is a society without punishment. That society has got beyond punishment, that kind of allows as many parasites, is a post-responsibility society. I think there's yeah, a bunch of people working on this today. There's this guy Dirk Pierboom, who has this kind of a bunch of stuff against. He's coming at this stuff from Spinoza, but he's against the idea of responsibility and thinks that the notion of responsibility is a deeply what's the word, harmful notion. It's a very Nietzschean idea. And there's this guy Greg Caruso, who was actually applied for a job here and was very interested, and then they changed rectors. But he's got a recent book called Against Retributivism. He just had a book out with Daniel Dennett as well. But there's a bunch of people who this is a big theme. Let me see if I can find. Rejecting retributivism. Yeah. So I think kind of in terms of there's also Dirk Pierboom. Sorry, I'll just. He's someone else who does this sort of more influenced by sort of anyway, there are two people I think are sort of interesting if you're into this sort of stuff. Yep. Hold on, I've lost where I was. I put them in the chat. Yeah, so I think what he's interested in is this sort of multifacetedness. And I take it that this is tied to his perspectivism. So this is something that is on page 118. I think there's a link between this discussion about the way that historical things don't have a single meaning is tied, I think, in many ways to this claim about perspectivalism. So I'm trying to find the page. Oh, I go too far and then I come back. Yeah. So in the third essay, Nietzsche has been discussing the aesthetic ideals, and these ideals of sort of denial. And then in section 12, he talks about the ideal of knowledge. Yeah, if what we care about is sort of yeah, he talks about kind of modern views of knowledge. Oh, there is a realm of truth, and being but risen is excluded from it. This is little take. So this section, he has this sort of discussion of Kant, the intelligible world that is sort of beyond comprehension, which is where truth is. So truth, what we desire is in some sense. So he thinks that this Kantian idea of the intelligible world being unknowable is a sort of, there is this world of pure being, which is the most real, and we just don't have any access to it. So we've got this sort of beyond. I think Nietzsche thinks this is very much a kind of a form of nihilism. And so he says, and Nietzsche's attitude towards knowledge is he's not against knowledge. He says but he thinks that if you care about knowledge, you're going to be pushed to his conclusions about knowledge. So he says, but precisely because we seek knowledge, let us not be ungrateful to such resolute reversals of accustomed perspective and valuations, with which the spirit has, with apparent mischievousness and fragility, raged against itself for so long. To see differently in this way for once, to want to see differently, is no small discipline and preparation of the intellect for its future objectivity. The latter, this ideal of objectivity, understood not as contemplation without interest. So we have this idea of objectivity as a disinterested, scientific, objective view on the world, but as the ability to control one's pros and cons and to dispose of them, so that one knows how to employ a variety of perspectives and effective interpretations in the service of knowledge. So there's this idea of objectivity that is this sort of castrated, what he calls a kind of castrated view of knowledge. It's castrated objectivity. It's the idea of intellect without will. It's the idea of having this godlike perspective on the world that is unconnected with any sort of desires or goals. Yeah, and I think this is the sort of thing that I think is attacked by Heidegger. Yeah, Heidegger has this sort of idea of which I think he's taking this from Nietzsche. That there's this perspective of scientific objectivity that is is one perspective amongst others, but sees itself as the highest perspective. And Nietzsche thinks that real objectivity, this sort of Nietzschean objectivity, involves not having this single will-less, divine, purely theoretical perspective on things, but it involves knowing how to employ a variety of perspectives and effective interpretations in the service of knowledge. So he says, and this is, I think, a paragraph you should all read carefully, because this is the sort of most famous defense of perspectivism, or one of the 2 or 3 in Nietzsche's work, the main one in this genealogy. He says, henceforth, my dear philosophers, let us be on our guard against the dangerous old conceptual fiction that posits a pure, will-less, painless, timeless, knowing subject. Let us kind of get rid of this fiction of a sort of purely objective scientific state on the world. Let us guard against the snares of such contradictory concepts as pure reason, absolute spirituality, knowledge in itself. These always demand that we should think of an I that is completely unthinkable. And yeah, so we have this idea of this is something Thomas Nagel, who wrote What Is It Like to Be a Bat? He talks about this. I mean, he has this idea of, he's got a book called The View from Nowhere. And so we have the idea of the ideal of knowledge is this view from nowhere. This is God's eye perspective that isn't from one particular perspective. It's a sort of perspectiveless perspective. And Nietzsche thinks that it doesn't make any sense. It always demands that we should think of an I that is completely unthinkable, a perspective that is unthinkable, an I turned in no particular direction, in which the active and interpreting forces through which alone seeing becomes seeing something are supposed to be lacking. So we have a type of knowledge that is kind of pure knowledge, doesn't involve any interpretation. Interpretation always involves interest. Yeah, we've got the thing and then we've got our interpretation. And our interpretation is always going to be connected to some interest, to some particular historically situated concerns we have. Yeah. So a sort of perspective that doesn't involve the will and doesn't involve any interpretation. These always demand of the I an absurdity and nonsense. Yeah, there is only a perspective. Okay, there is only a perspective seeing, only a perspective knowing. And the more affects we allow to speak about one thing, the more eyes, different eyes we can use to observe one thing, the more complete will be our concept of this thing, our objectivity. Yes, so learning to see things from many different perspectives. This is his sort of ideal of sort of knowledge. And I think he thinks that one kind of weaker version of this is, oh, then we try and unify these perspectives into higher perspectives. But I think Nietzsche thinks that these perspectives are going to be, many of them are going to be not unifiable because they're perspectives driven by particular interest, and we may have incompatible interests, incompatible desires. Yeah. But to eliminate the will altogether, to suspend each and every affect, supposing we're capable of this, what would this mean but to castrate the intellect? Yeah. Castration, Turkish, cutting off the testicles. Yeah. What's the Turkish for that? Is that? Okay. It's good to learn some Turkish. Yeah, but it's now we've got these different passions. We've got these different so to eliminate the will altogether. So to suspend each and every affect would mean to castrate the intellect. Now, I take it that there's a sort of postmodernist, sort of, you know, the sort of Derridian people influenced by Derrida's reading of Nietzsche, like Nietzsche was influenced by Schopenhauer, and Schopenhauer had this idea of art as sort of redemption. Yeah, you've got the world, which is a world of suffering, of pain, it's meaningless, and the best thing is just not to have existed. Yeah, but we have these moments of sort of aesthetic beauty of and especially listening to music, when in some sense the will is stopped, and sort of art, music can redeem the world. Yeah, and I think in his earlier years, Nietzsche fell under the spell of Wagner, and Wagner had this very Schopenhauerian idea that Nietzsche sort of went along with, that kind of art is the redemption. That really art should come before everything. I think by the time that he broke this period, he'd sort of broken with Wagner. I think even in his earlier work, like in The Birth of Tragedy, we have these two forces in tragedy, the Dionysian and the Apollinarian, Apollo and Dionysus. And it's not like Nietzsche wants to prioritize one. I think he thinks that tragedy involves the sort of harmony of the Dionysian and the Apollinarian. Yeah, that the music is Dionysian, the chorus is Dionysian, but the drummer on the stage is Apollo. And what tragedy does is to combine in a fruitful way these two contradictory sort of viewpoints, these two contradictory positions. And in some sense, in drama, we get to kind of be both Dionysian. In tragedy, we get both to be Dionysian and Apollinarian. Yeah. And I take it, yeah, that when we're thinking about this ability of knowing how to imply a variety of perspectives and effective interpretations, yeah, the not to eliminate the will, but to, in some sense, have many different eyes, many different wills. So one of the things then, and then we move into at the end of this book is the sort of conflict between the will to truth and the will to deception. Yeah, the sort of science and art. Yeah, and then we might think, well, what should we give priority to? Is Nietzsche saying we should kind of reject science and embrace art as the sort of highest ideal? And of course, if you've just read this passage, I think the answer, in some sense, on my understanding, is quite clear in the context of this passage. That in some sense, that you shouldn't think of either of them as highest. Yeah, that these are two different wills, and the kind of rich individual contains multitudes, and is able to basically be both driven by a desire for knowledge and a desire and creativity. Yeah, the art and science are two different, and the aspects you have when you take these. Yep, and it's not like you can have a higher perspective that contains these. Yeah, that's the thing he wants to get away from. But the idea that you have to choose one perspective over another is, I think, part of this kind of monotheistic sort of ideal. There's only one God. Whereas if you're into a sort of polytheism, yeah, you could just have lots of different gods. And you could hang out with Zeus on one day and with Athena tomorrow. Like yeah. So learning how to have both of these wills without being torn apart, yeah, but without, in some sense, unifying them into a single will. Yeah, so in some sense, one has to learn how to contain multitudes. Yeah, so at the end of the book, he has this long discussion of the will to truth. Now, one thing is he thinks that I'm in the wrong page. Yeah. Now, yeah, so he finishes off the book, and this is at the beginning of the first section of Beyond Good and Evil, is about we philosophers. So if you find this interesting, then you might. He says he has a bunch of interesting stuff questioning the will to truth at the beginning of Beyond Good and Evil. If you find this interesting, so he says, at this point, it's necessary to pause and take careful stock. Science itself henceforth requires justification, which is not to say that there is any such justification. Yeah. Consider on this question both the earliest and most recent philosophers. They are all oblivious of how much the will to truth itself first requires justification. Here there is a lacuna in every philosophy. How did this become about? Because the aesthetic idea has hitherto dominated all philosophy. Because truth was posited as being, as God, as the highest court of appeal. Because truth was not permitted to be a problem at all. Is this permitted, understood? From the moment faith in God of the aesthetic ideal is denied, a new problem arises, that of the value of truth. Yeah. The will to truth requires a critique. So of course we've got, once again, I take it this is a part of, this is taking Kant to the limit. Yeah, that we do need a critique of reason, but Kant's critique of pure reason didn't go far enough because it didn't critique truth. Yep. Let us define our own task. The value of truth must for once be experimentally caused into question. Now, I think Nietzsche thinks that he values truth. He's driven by a will to truth, but that this will to truth leads him to question the value of truth. Yeah, and I think he thinks that sometimes truth is harmful. Sometimes caring about truth is unhealthy. Sometimes and I take it that once again, I think there's this influence of Hölderlin, who was driven by this sort of desire to create new myths to live by. So Nietzsche thinks that kind of as self-interpreting beings, we need myths in order to live. And then we must ask ourselves, well, is this myth true? And at some point you might think, well, who cares? Yeah, like if it's a myth that is a beautiful myth that allows you to live well, then asking the question about is it true? Yeah, you might think, is that something one should care about? And if one does care about it, should that, the fact that you discover that it's not true, should that, the fact that you know that your the myths you live by aren't true, should this undermine their value and function as myths? Yeah, and I think Nietzsche's sort of thought is no. Yeah, so as we've got philosophy, then he introduces this opposing idea. Where is the opposing will expressing the opposing ideal, the opposing ideal to science and to philosophy? He says science is not nearly self-reliant enough to be that. It first requires in every respect an ideal of value, a value-creating power, in the service of which it could believe in itself. Science never creates values. So science cares about truth, but it never creates values. So there has to be something that is the sort of source of values. Yeah, the source of normativity that he thinks isn't going to be this will to truth. And what is this? Science and the aesthetic ideal both rest upon the same foundation, on the same overestimation of truth. Now, he doesn't want to deny truth. So this overestimation of truth, he says more explicitly, on the same belief that truth is inestimable and cannot be criticized. Yeah, so that I don't think he wants to reject truth with a small t. He wants to reject truth with a big T. That the idea of truth as this kind of Platonic ideal beyond. I take it truth with a small t. This is not something like coming to know stuff, doing research. Nietzsche is driven by this, but he wants to question the value of truth, and he thinks that many people in the philosophical tradition have this overestimation of truth, because they put the theory. I mean, I think that the people who care about truth have primarily put the theoretical before the practical. In some sense, you might think the practical is primary. This is a very 19th century idea. It goes back to Kant, the priority of practical reason. You find it in Hegel. I think you've got something similar here, that taking truth as primary puts theoretical understanding first. Whereas we have needs. We are beings with needs, with desires, with yep. And so, what is this opposing thing? Yep. Depreciation of the aesthetic ideal unavoidably involves the depreciation of science, not a denial of science, but kind of in some sense the idea of not making science, not replacing God with science, not replacing God with the idea of a scientific understanding of the world. Yeah. So what's the opposition? Well, art. Art, to say it in advance, for I shall someday return to this subject at greater length. Little did he know that the syphilis would get him, before he had a chance to do this. Art in which precisely the lie is sanctified and the will to deception has a good conscience. So art, you basically lie. If you're writing a novel, if you're a good Kantian and you read a novelist, you say, well, you're just telling a story. If you ask Dostoevsky, so this Raskolnikov, did he exist? And Dostoevsky is going to be saying no. You might say, but Dostoevsky, you're just lying. Everything you've written is a lie. That's what fiction is. It's a lie. You're just writing down statements that are not true. There is no Sherlock Holmes. Art, literature is a lie. It's driven by the will to deception. You want people to read something as if it's real when it's not. It's much more fundamentally opposed to the aesthetic ideal than is science. This was instinctively sensed by Plato, the greatest enemy of art Europe has yet produced. At the end of the Republic, he said the poets should be barred from the ideal republic. Plato versus Homer. That is the genuine antagonism. They're the sincerest advocate of the beyond, the great slanderer of life. That's Plato. So Plato posits a world of forms beyond. That's what's true. And this is the beginning of the religious ideal, that in religion, Nietzsche thinks that you make up something that doesn't exist. And then you say that's what has value. And you say it's something that transcends life that has value. Yep. And then you affirm that which is beyond, which involves denying life. Yeah. So the Plato, because he kind of sets up this transcendent realm beyond the world of becoming, you've got being versus becoming. And it's the world of being that transcends becoming that is the real world, and that this is the world that is to be valued if you're a Platonist. And Plato, of course, is the origin of this sort of monotheistic Christian conception of I think anyway, that's my take. Yeah, the great slanderer of life. Yeah, the instinctive deifier. And so, here the instinctive deifier, the golden nature, this is Homer, to place it in service of the aesthetic idea of distinctive corruption of artists. So we have this tension set up between the artist and the philosopher, the artist and the scientist. And that he thinks that science can be life-denying, can involve in a certain type of impoverishment of life. Insofar as a philosopher is what you care about are these sort of abstract ideas that are kind of eternal truths, that if that's where you place your value, you implicitly end up denying the value of life. Now, this is Nietzsche's view. We'll come back to some of these quotes. So I mean, we're going to spend next week, I'm going to go back and start at the beginning and then work through in order through the book. I wanted to first of all give you an overview of what I take to be the main themes of the book. My sort of take, though, is that Nietzsche, thinks that is into this sort of richness, this sort of pagan vitality, where he doesn't want to go back to this noble view that it's with the slave revolt in morality that man becomes interesting. It's with this the slave revolt in morality involves these people who lack power to torture others. They lack power to dominate others, so they dominate themselves. So the emergence of civilization and culture comes about through self-torture. And through torturing ourselves, we sort of, this desire to dominate is a desire to sort of inform. It's a desire to be creative, to impose your creativity is imposing your will on something. And if you can't impose your will on something external, Nietzsche thought is we impose it on ourselves and we turn ourselves into works of art through this sort of internalization of man. Yeah. And this internalization is not, I mean, these nobles are basically animals. They're not interesting. They don't have any inner life. They are self-affirming, but there is no real self there to affirm because they don't have any. They just react. They just allow. They're able to express themselves and act naturally. So with this sort of internalization, I think human beings become interesting, but this sort of self-interpretation, Nietzsche thinks, has become very unhealthy. Yeah. So Nietzsche thinks that what's needed is a sort of reevaluation of values, to kind of invent new myths, new systems, ways of thinking about what it is to have a good life, what it is to be a human being, what the value of pain and suffering is. That is going to be healthier than what he takes to be the Christian ethics. Now, I think Nietzsche's kind of final book, next book, was going kind of, he was planning this book that was aimed to, I think, try and engage with this. He's got this idea of what's needed is a new creative genius, sort of antichrist, who's going to be the kind of founder of this new paganism, and this is already Nietzsche kind of, in Ecce Homo, he sort of suggests that who this person is himself. And by the time of Ecce Homo, the syphilis has really started to kick in. So yeah, the titles, yeah, the titles of the sections are Why I Am So Wise, Why I Am So Clever, Why I Write Such Good Books, and Why I Am Destiny. Yeah, I mean, yeah, and I think he saw himself as aiming at this reevaluation of values. So what he's calling for in the genealogy of morals is the need for a kind of the need of new values for a post-Christian world. So he thinks that in the 19th century, Christianity has sort of died. This monotheism in Europe has sort of died. And what's taking its place is either a faith in science, which is just, in some sense, keeping the transcendent, keeping the God's eye perspective without God, or nihilism. And what's needed is a sort of set, a new kind of new values for this new Europe. And Nietzsche himself kind of went mad before he, but that's what I think he was kind of aiming for. Yeah. Okay, so I will see you in class tomorrow. Hopefully, some of you, hopefully more than today. And yeah. Okay, and so I've given you an overview of Nietzsche. If you have any questions, the beginning of next class, and then otherwise I will just start talking from the beginning. Yeah. And if there are particular passages that you read that you've had problems with, perhaps you can also, I'll ask you about those. Okay, bye-bye. Yeah. Oops.